Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for tonight's Archives and Preservation Q&A session. I'm Scott Lotus, President and Executive Director of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, and we are delighted to be able to bring you this session tonight via WebEx with our archivist, Adrienne Evans, joining us from her home across town, where she lives with her partner, Johnny, and cats, Gary and Squidward. Hi, Adrienne.
Hey, can you see and hear me all right?
Loud and clear on my end.
Oh, great.
A couple of housekeeping tips before we get started. We'll be happy to take questions or comments through the Q&A feature of WebEx. You should be able to find that in the lower right-hand corner of the presentation window. If you'd like to change your display, there are a few different options available there. You can access those by going to the round buttons in the upper right-hand corner of the presentation window and click through the options there. That should take care of about everything you need. If you're having any troubles, Haley is standing by and we'll try to troubleshoot as best we can, although we are still learning our ways around the video conferencing programs and such. So we do have a bunch of questions to get through, and so we'll try to get started here pretty quickly. Just as a means of introduction, I think most of you know us, the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. Our mission is to preserve and present significant images of railroading. And we do that through a number of different programs, including our traveling exhibitions, our conferences, virtual right now, of course, our awards program. I see a cat in the background. Our publications, we just sent our new issue of Railroad Heritage to the printer, as well as our new book featuring the photography of Donald Furler, drawing on one of our collections. Those both went to the printer yesterday. The magazine will be out to members around June 1st, and then the book will be out in September, available for purchase. It's going to be a spectacular volume, and we're looking forward to both of those. And then, of course, we also preserve photography collections. In fact, that's probably become our biggest single programmatic focus over the past few years, thanks to Adrienne's capable leadership and Jordan Radke, our archives manager, prior to her. Adrienne came to us from History Colorado in Denver, where she spent 2 years as a project archivist working on their 20th century photography collections. She also spent a year at the Image Permanence Institute in Rochester, New York. She's done work with Montana Historical Society, as well as the Wisconsin Historical Society here in Madison, where she did her master's degree from the School of Library Information Studies, now the iSchool, as the rebranding continues. Adrienne brings a wealth of knowledge and a great passion for photography, and we're really delighted that she's agreed to go through and take some questions and try to share some archives and preservation tips. I know it's a topic that's important to all of us as photographers and collectors. So just in the terms of format for how things are going to run tonight, we asked for questions in advance, so we'd have a little bit of time to prepare for them. We got a bunch. We got more than 60 questions submitted from you. We thank you so much for those. These really helped kind of frame the talk tonight. And they fall roughly into 3 categories. We're going to be starting first with kind of the big picture questions about the center, about our collections, and also just about the nature of archiving in general. From then, we're going to move into analog preservation concerns, specifically for slides, negatives, prints, and other physical photographs, how best to care for and take care of those. And then we'll wrap it up with an extended segment on probably the most popular topic, digitization and digital preservation. So we have a lot of ground to cover tonight. We're going to try to move quickly to get through as much of it as we can. If there's any extra time at the end, we can try to take some additional questions then. And if we can't get to everything tonight, we can look into arranging a follow-up session. We are also recording this session tonight, and we'll try to make that available for future viewing. And I think Adrienne will have some resources to pass along with a follow-up email after we finished up tonight. So with that, Adrienne, I'm going to pass the presenter baton over to you. And I think we should be good to go then.
Yep. Okay.
All right.
All right. Fire away.
Okay. So we're going to start off again with the big picture institutional questions. First one of those, pretty easy. How many photos does our archive have?
Well, it's easy right now. So there are approximately 300,000 currently in Madison, but we are growing. We're projected to have about 600,000 within the next few years.
And how are they organized?
So the archives are organized by provenance, meaning that images donated together are grouped together and stored discreetly by collection. When we organize within collections, we typically preserve the creator's original order if possible. Now, sometimes we can't detect an original order. That can happen a lot in archiving. So then we impose one. And generally, we group photographs by railroad because we're the Center for Railroad Photography and Art.
And another question a few people asked is, do we digitize every single image in these collections?
So, up until recently, our model, for the most part, has been to digitize collections on the item level. We have grown considerably in the last few years and are likely going to have to move away from this type of model just to keep up with the influx of large collections. We're currently exploring digitizing selections or highlights from certain collections, and this type of digitization is pretty common at most archival institutions. What to prioritize when digitizing is kind of a challenge. Obviously, we'll still digitize any at-risk materials that come in, but beyond that, priorities are not as clear. And this is something that we're currently reviewing with the Collections and Acquisitions Committee of our board.
Yeah, no, that's definitely going to be a challenge we'll have to address going forward, just based on the sheer numbers of images that we deal with. And, I love looking through the collections, and it's fun. I mean, within every collection we have, there are just some incredible images, and really some of the fun is mining through and getting those. And that's been easier to do because we've digitized everything. But again, it's just probably not going to be practical forever going forward. So, but these are good problems to have as we grow as an institution, as an archive, and we'll try to find the best compromise we can there. It's always a balance between taking on as much as we can and then also making sure that we have the resources to preserve it not only now but for all time.
Absolutely.
So, and a related question to that is, do we have a standardized system that we use to index images and to link individual images to information about them that is then available to photographers or researchers?
Sure. So we currently record metadata, and that's caption information or data about the data, in Excel sheets using the VRA core metadata standard. And this is linked to both the corresponding electronic file and the physical object by the same file name or call number.
And could you say just a little bit about VRA Core for people who might not be familiar with it?
Sure. So this is the standard used by the Visual Resources Association. It's something I'm going to go over a little more in detail when we get on to digitization. But basically, we found it attractive because it has associated tools that allow us to embed metadata within our images in kind of almost in a batch or group way.
Yeah, which is important with the volumes that we deal with again.
Yeah, totally.
So Michael Pisno asked, what happens to the originals after the photographs have been digitized? How are those original materials stored?
Right. So we do hold on to the originals. I think most people will be relieved to know. They're stored in archival grade boxes and enclosures at our offsite storage space. This space is climate controlled. We typically try to keep it in the 60 to 64 degree Fahrenheit range with about 35% relative humidity. It also has a fire suppression system, sprinklers, and is security monitored 24/7.
And we just moved into that this past fall. It was a good step in the right direction for us, and we hope to continue to make incremental improvements, I think, going forward. And that actually leads into our next question, which is, well, actually, we have two people, Jerry Libby and Mel Patrick. Hi, guys, who both asked, basically, how do our preservation practices stack up against the standards suggested by various authors in the fields, as well as the procedures at other similar institutions?
Okay, so this is going to be kind of a long-winded answer, and I do have a slide I will pop up in a couple minutes. But first, it's important to remember CRPA did not start out with such a focus on archiving. It's always been part of what we do, but over the last 10 years, and informed by the needs our community has presented to us, we've made an institutional shift toward collecting much more material for permanent retention. In doing so, we've sought to immediately provide permanent homes for railroad photography collections while incrementally and systematically improving our preservation practices and environment. That said, CRPA does follow archival best practices for the housing and handling of collections. For example, enclosures and boxes are archival grade and appropriately sized for the materials they're in. And I will elaborate on what archival grade means in a minute. And staff members and interns are trained on how to handle archival materials appropriately, holding things with the proper support, and always wearing gloves when we handle collections. So when it comes to environmental standards, there are some ISO recommendations that I'm going to attempt to share with you now. Give me one moment to pop up my screen.
Looks like a cold day in Albany.
Yep. From the Jim Shaughnessy collection.
Yeah, one of the couple hundred of glass plates that we've been delighted to find in there.
Are you seeing my slide?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. So research shows that lower temperature and relative humidity can greatly improve material stability. And this fact is reflected in the standards published by the International Organization for Standardization. These ISO standards recommend climate conditions for the storage of specific media when possible, these recommendations should be followed. As you can see, black and white prints and polyester film tend to last longer under more normal office-like conditions that can be achieved in most buildings. However, color materials, acetate negatives, and nitrate-based negatives require much cooler and drier conditions for longevity. These ideals can be daunting for smaller institutions, as well as folks trying to preserve at home. And I will say that they are aspirational for us. And we feel that the best way to achieve them is to start a cold storage program, but we do not offer that at this time. We are planning to install upright freezer units to house nitrates, deteriorating acetate negatives, and significant color work. So I know everyone is pretty interested in actually getting these down, so I will try to get them out in an email as well. But I am gonna, for the sake of time, move on right now.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great slide. And again, we'll try to make as much of this information available with handouts. And I think Adrian can point out some resources on our website later on too.
Absolutely.
So shifting a little bit away from technical specs now more to actually the process of intake and kind of what we like to see there. Steve Patterson, hi Steve, asked a really important question, and that's whether we prefer to receive a person's photography collection before they die or posthumously.
Sure. So we do prefer to receive collections within a photographer's lifetime for many reasons. First, the creator of the material is an invaluable resource when we're identifying images, gathering contextual information, and working with metadata. And then second, receiving unexpected donations via bequest is super challenging. From a capacity standpoint, we're not always prepared to accept big donations with little to no notice. Plus, all potential donations need to be approved by our board of directors following a review by our collections and acquisitions committee. Unsolicited bequests, no matter how well intentioned, and we really appreciate people thinking of us like all the time for, you know, a home for their potential materials, but they're less likely to be approved by the BOD and do put staff members in kind of a weird position of figuring out like who should have custody of materials that may not pass the BOD.
Yeah, no, I mean these are challenging positions, and I mean again, it's a good problem to have based on our institutional growth and just based on the tremendous outpouring of support and interest we have from all of you in our community. But again, I mean, a photography collection, you know, the ones we deal with are typically in the range of tens of thousands of images. And you know, because we do strive for a high level of digitization, and because we also try to make sure that we're using the materials not only in our own publications, but also making them available and accessible to others. And Adrian, I know just in the past few months, you've been dealing with a lot more image requests, which is great. But again, it takes time. It takes time away from processing as we're working to build up our capacity, which we will continue to do. And we will grow as quickly as we feel that we responsibly can, so that we can take on as much as we can. But again, we feel really strongly that if we're going to take something on, we want to make sure that we're going to have the resources in place, not only now, but for all time to keep those collections safe. We know how much time and effort and work goes into creating those, and we just want to make sure that we can do the best we can by them. But it's a great question, Steve, and we'd certainly ask anyone who's interested to get in touch with us sooner than later, and we can at least get that discussion started. Um, Another question that actually relates well to Steve's is what can photographers do to make it easier for a person or institution that may want to acquire their collection in the future?
So there are a lot of things, but I would say number one is to organize your photographs. Create an
Yep.
organizational scheme or arrangement for your collection. It doesn't have to be any certain way. It can be by date, by railroad, by location. As long as it's consistent, it's something that when we get your materials, we'll be able to make better sense of them. Also, document that scheme too, if possible. And another thing would be to create captions or record metadata for individual images if possible. And if you're going through doing this, I would prioritize recording dates created as well as the locations depicted in the image. A lot of the other information, especially with railroad photography, we can figure out from the image itself, but date and location can definitely be a mystery.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those are definitely the ones to prioritize. And we all have a lot more time to do that stuff like that right now, so take advantage of it.
It's the perfect time.
Brian Matsumoto asks, well, actually, it starts with a comment just saying that Brian suspects that there's always going to be some bad or questionable content within any collection. Yeah, I mean, we all have off days. How do we make the decisions of what is good and what is not worth keeping?
So yeah, we currently do not carry out like aesthetically motivated deep sessions on the item level. We know every photographer has off days or experiences a learning curve with a new medium or even makes bracketing or test shots. We just usually don't feature those on our website or Flickr galleries, but we don't actively weed them out of the collection if they're a little questionable. Speaking of deaccessions, we do sometimes find images within collections that do not fit our collecting scope. A good example would be family photographs that sometimes just get mixed in with the railroad collection. And in these cases, we typically try to deaccession them and return them to the family if possible.
So let's see. Next up, several people actually asked about when we plan to accept native digital photographs for the archive.
Sure. This is a big one.
Yes.
So for folks who don't know, we don't currently accept born digital images into the archive. And this is not because we feel that there's some inherent difference in regards to value between born digital and analog images. Archivists consider both equally important parts of the historic record and also acknowledge that really great work has been made in both mediums. The only difference to us is how we preserve them. So we've made the decision not to take born digital because responsible digital preservation involves a certain set of practices and procedures as well as technical expertise. Digital is also still a relatively young medium, and there's much more to be discovered concerning the permanence of digital files. So all of that said, we do not have a specific date set to begin retaining born digital, and we certainly understand that there is a need within the community. Our focus has traditionally been analog photography, and there's certainly more than enough to keep us busy right now. With all of that said, we are currently working for an NEH preservation grant that will help us develop formal digital preservation procedures, as well as a consultant to help advise on the formulation of those procedures. And once all of that is in place, I think we'll be in a much better place to begin exploring collecting born digital.
And if we could just figure out a way to clone you and Natalie in the meantime, that would help immensely too.
I'll work on that.
If anyone knows how to do that, get in touch with us. So we had another question from a Phyllis Krockmall, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, Phyllis, but she asked if we have dining car photographs in our collections, and she also asks about any good books about railroad dining cars.
Sure. So we do have dining car photos in various collections. Wallace Abbey is the first one I generally think of. But we don't have a specific collection dedicated to dining cars, unfortunately, right now. I'd love to see one. And Scott, I think you might be in a better position to recommend books or reading on the subject.
Yeah, there's been a few. A couple by a friend of mine, actually, Jim Porterfield. He did Dining by Rail and From the Dining Car. Those get into the history of dining cars, and they also include some recipes, which might be fun to try out right now as we're at least thinking about taking train trips. There's been some others that focus more on specific railroads dining cars. I know there's one in the B&O, Northern Pacific, I think a few others too. If you look on, any of the online book retailers, I think you might be able to find some of those. But there are definitely some resources out there. And as you mentioned, Adrian, the Abbey collection is a really good one for dining car photographs from the 1950s up through the 60s and even into the Amtrak era in the 70s and beyond. Um, Patrick Cashin asks a specific question. Do we have any of O. Winston Link's original negatives?
No, unfortunately not. We do have a dozen or so prints that have been donated by Link print owners, but the original negatives themselves would likely be held by the O. Winston Link Museum in Virginia.
Yeah, that's right. Um, and then we have a kind of a question that's going to transition us out of these sort of bigger picture questions and more into the analog side of things. But Justin Franz up in Montana asks, he knows that many of our members are most interested in photo and photo storage, but he's asking for advice on the preservation of non-photographic material, particularly things that would accompany the photo collection, such as field notes from trips, railroad documents like employee timetables or other things that might help to better interpret the images in a collection. So what's your advice on those, Adrian?
So typically in an archive, we would treat those as part of the archival collection. We might just separate it into a manuscripts or notes portion. But I think most important would be preserving the paper-based materials. You're going to want acid-free, lignin-free enclosures, and also a way to be able to trace the notes back to the photographs that they're actually referring to. So some type of control number would be good that's kind of shared between both, the negative and the print and the notes. That would be my best recommendation.
Yeah, and that kind of information is so valuable to have. The new book on the Donald Furler collection, Don's son Alan provided us with all kinds of letters that his father sent back and forth to the editors of Trains magazine. And they were just invaluable, not only to learn more about the photographs, but also to get a better sense of Don as a photographer. I mean, someone I never got to meet, but feel like I got to know through reading these letters. I mean, it really helps make a collection come alive, helps me as an author do a much better job on the book, and certainly be of interest to researchers and other people that would be working on these projects in the future. All right, so shifting gears now into analog preservation, and Dan Cupper starts with, I think, a pretty big and basic and really important question of just the best way to store prints in various sizes, whether they're little kind of drugstore formats all the way up to 8x10s or larger, and if there's any differences between color versus black and white.
Sure. So this is kind of going to be a long-winded answer. There's a lot of parts to this, but let's start with enclosures. This is the material that comes into direct contact with the print. So enclosures for photographic print should always be made either of high-quality paper or one of several stable plastics. All enclosure and storage materials should pass the photographic activity test, and this is kind of a big one. This is an ISO standard as well. So the photographic activity test, based on accelerated aging, this test predicts the interaction that may take place over time between processed silver gelatin, color, and diazo photographic images with the materials used to house or display them. So beyond that, your choice of enclosure depends on how you're using your collection. You may choose to house photographic prints in acid-free paper sleeves or folders within an archival box or shallow cabinet. Metal is definitely preferred over wood because wood off-gases acid. And this has its advantages. You can label the sleeves and folders. It's usually less expensive than plastic. And this is typically how I've seen smaller format photographic prints stored at archival institutions. So it's also acceptable to encapsulate your prints individually in polyethylene, polypropylene, or polyester sleeves and store them in an archival box or a binder. This has advantages, especially for collections that are handled frequently. Plastic provides immediate visual access to the images without hands-on contact. However, you should be aware of the possibility of buildup of static energy or static electricity within some plastics. This can attract dirt or dust that can damage the surfaces of prints. Also, if your space floods, plastic enclosures may ferrotype the surfaces of your images as they dry. And plastic should never be used for photographs that have flaking or lifting emulsions, especially with the static electricity element. And also, you could go enclosure free to an extent. In this case, you would just place your prints inside a box and interleave each print with archival grade paper. I've typically seen this done in collections of oversized matted prints. So prints can either be stored vertically or horizontally. If horizontally, resting on the longest edge. Small to moderate size formats in good condition can be stored upright. This system provides easy access. You just have to make sure the box is packed snugly enough to prevent slumping. This can lead to like curling in the prints. Flat storage is safer if you want to avoid this. Large prints can be stored horizontally in shallow drawers or boxes. Just make sure not to pack them too deep. Pressure on the items at the bottom can damage mounted prints and exacerbate the possibility of ferrotyping. And then I just want to make one more note on archival enclosures, and I'll stop blabbing about this relatively simple question. So when you're looking at enclosures, you're likely to encounter buffered versus unbuffered materials. So with buffered materials, they've been treated with calcium carbonate to raise the pH level of the paper to the alkaline side of the pH scale. This is usually around 8.5 or so. This does assure an absolutely non-acidic enclosure, and the reservoir of the calcium carbonate also helps neutralize other acid in the environment that could make materials acidic over time. These are especially helpful for acetate and nitrate negatives, prints mounted on acidic boards, and deteriorating prints. It has been contested whether certain types of photographic materials, such as color, are adversely affected by the alkalinity and buffering. So the solution here would be to choose an unbuffered enclosure that has neutral pH. But most say that concerns are mostly theoretical at this point when measured against the benefits of buffered paper enclosures. That said, if you are handling like dye transfer prints or cyanotypes, you should definitely keep them unbuffered. The image substance of both these types can be harmed by the alkaline.
Adrian, I mean, that's some great information, and I am curious when and maybe you'll get to this later, but when we're talking about archival materials and archival grade materials, you know, where's the good place for your average photographer to find some of these types of materials?
I know B&H can offer some. I've seen stuff advertised as archival. You just have to make sure that it passes the photographic activity test, and it'll usually say something like PAT or PAT approved. You can also get archival supplies through Gaylord, Metal Edge, University Products, and I've even gotten some from Uline, although they don't have as many like specialized like boxes and formats.
Right. No, that's, yeah. And if anyone has questions about those later, we can try to take those specifically by email and follow up.
Yeah.
So Ken Rehor asks about old negatives and how they should be preserved, noting that the original negative sleeves he used were not archival, and now looks like the negatives might need to be cleaned and then properly refiled. What advice would you have for that situation?
So storage is kind of similar. Like prints, old negatives can be stored in paper or plastic theoretically. Acetate or nitrate negatives specifically should be stored in individual buffered paper sleeves because plastic enclosures can actually trap the harmful off-gassing that often goes on. And this further accelerates the deterioration of the image and the film. And a specific note, definitely when you're looking at paper sleeves, avoid glassine, even if it's acid-free. It's been a traditional material for storing negatives and for interleaving, but it's no longer recommended for use. Basically, buffering causes glassine to lose its translucency, and the thin unbuffered paper, so when it's not buffered, quickly can absorb environmental acids and moistures. Sometimes it can stick to the negative itself, which is a really unfortunate thing to see. But yeah, that'd be my advice.
I mean, I think that speaks to just some of the challenges we face in the archives field is that, we're trying to preserve things for a very long time when we are working with things that just haven't existed for all that long. And I mean, we've learned so much about, traditional photographic materials over the past couple of decades, and compared to digital, we're just getting started. So,
Yeah, totally.
The knowledge base is always changing. Okay, well, we've talked about prints, we've talked about negatives. Now we've got a couple of questions about slide storage that came from Bill Schaefer and Elron Lawrence and several other folks asking about this. And basically, they're asking what's the best way to store slides. They've and some of the examples people use are everything from having pages within binders to the metal Logan boxes that I know a lot of us use, to even more simplistic methods like cigar boxes. So, what would you recommend for slides?
Sure. First, I don't think cigar boxes are archivally sound. I hope I'm not bursting any bubbles. I would recommend rehousing the slides that are in the cigar boxes. Second, regarding Logan boxes. So archivists usually don't trust materials that are not PAT approved for long-term storage. I have not been able to find information concerning whether there are Logan boxes that have been tested by PAT. And I should mention that material that isn't PAT approved is not always harmful to your photos. It just means it has not been tested yet. So to be on the safe side, I would recommend not using Logan or cigar boxes and using any of the aforementioned enclosure materials we've talked about, whether that's, polyethylene, polypropylene sleeves in a binder, or they even make specific just archival boxes that are meant for slides that separate the slides with little acid-free tabs.
I've actually been in the process of moving my slides out of Logan boxes and into pages and binders as I've been going through and digitizing and labeling them.
Sure.
And I don't even have that many slides, so I understand the challenges.
It takes forever, yeah.
All right, well, Ross Harrison asks about Avery labels, like the kinds you get in a stationery store. Would those be safe to use on negative pages or on photographic prints? Should he seek out acid-free ones to minimize damage? What are your feelings about those adhesive labels?
Sure. Well, I would say if you're going to use Avery labels, definitely seek out the acid-free kind. We have utilized them ourselves in the past for box labels. But it is important to note that, so they're a pressure-sensitive media, and like any pressure-sensitive media, the labels will fail as they age. Under dry conditions, the adhesive dries up and the label falls off whatever it's adhered to. We've seen this happen with boxes just as they've been moved to the much drier environment of our archive space in the past few months. So I would just be aware of that. I would also avoid placing them directly on your prints. Even though they're advertised as acid-free and archival, that doesn't mean there won't be some long-term effect on your images, assuming they're going to be preserved hopefully forever. Adhesives can often be acidic or chemically unstable as they age. So.
Let's see. One more question about materials, and that's another specific one. DuPont Tyvek wrap, is that considered archivally safe for storage of color or black and white photographs?
So this will be another PAT-inspired answer, because I have tried to look it up to see if it's been tested, and I can't find any evidence of it being tested. So I'm just going to have to say no on the fact that it's just, if it's not PAT approved, it's kind of an unknown. So just to be on the safe side, I would go with some other material that's been approved by the photographic.
Sure. A couple questions now about environment. Louise Kashalik asks, what's the best place to store negatives within your house? When Adrian,
Sure.
I think you froze there for a sec.
I did. Can you hear me in real time now?
Yes.
Okay. I think I got that question. It's the house question.
Yeah, where to store negatives in a house?
Sure. Best place to store negatives would ideally be in a freezer, which is not super realistic for most of us. So barring that, I would say store negatives in temperature controlled areas where your RH and your temperature do not fluctuate very much. So these would probably be the main living levels. Also away from the bathroom, because obviously the shower is going to raise the RH. Also avoid basements because they flood, avoid attics because they experience temperature extremes and can host pests. Definitely avoid garages and sheds. Lots of corrosive chemicals get stored there and they are not temperature controlled unless you're wealthy.
um, so, and then this, I mean, this is something we've seen. David Maney notes that sometimes mold and fungus can grow on color slides. Yeah, we've seen that too.
Yeah.
Typically due to temperature and humidity. Once something like that happens, what's the best way to clean a slide? And once an image is digitized, we know that software can save the day, but how can the original be saved from mold or fungus?
Sure. This is kind of a frustrating question for archivists, and I'll explain why in a minute. But mold is possible when photographs become more damp and are not immediately dried or stabilized. It's a problem that we take pretty seriously as collection manager types because active mold can spread throughout a collection, and whether it's active or inactive, it can be a health hazard. So in archives, there are several levels of activity involved in responding to mold. First, environmental conditions that support the mold growth have to be improved before anything can be fixed. Then we take mold damaged materials and isolate them from the non-contaminated parts of the collection to ensure it doesn't spread. This is usually enough to stop the active spread on affected materials, although in some cases you have to freeze the material to actually get the mold to deactivate. So inactive mold bodies and debris can become airborne during handling, so actual cleaning does need to take place before affected materials can be reincorporated in the collection. Cleaning is typically done by a trained conservator or industrial hygienist. I have a degree in archival science, but I am not qualified to clean mold because I have not been trained as a conservator, and that's typically how it works within larger archival institutions. And a conservator will usually accomplish mold remediation using a vacuum cleaner fitted with a HEPA filter.
So the best advice there is to avoid mold, I think, in the first place.
Best advice to avoid mold. You can ask a conservator. They may actually be able to train you.
Right.
I think the Northeast Document Conservation Center has a hotline that you can call and ask conservators these types of questions. And that is something I will absolutely send out via link when this is all done.
Yeah, and you've had some conversations with them in previous questions we've had, haven't you?
Yep. Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, no, that's a really good resource. Really quickly to circle back to the labels question, Kate Kratvale Roden sent in a question just in terms of um, getting some kind of metadata onto your prints. Is it better to use pen or pencil when you're writing on the backs of prints?
I would say it's better to lightly use pencil. There are certain types of ink that are chemically unstable and can react with photographic materials. Typically, I try to avoid stuff like that altogether. But yeah, just a pencil, a number two, and don't press too hard, or else you're gonna emboss like you're writing onto the image, which is not great.
Yeah, yeah, we've seen I think prints in our collection where the inks actually seep through from the back and actually shows up on the front of the print. So, I mean,
Sure.
yeah, you want to get the information with the prints, but you don't want to damage the prints in the process.
Yeah.
Well, getting back to, I think, kind of another conservation question, Christopher Manthe asks, is there any way to physically clean fingerprints or other substances off of your slides if you have gotten some of those greasy fingerprints on them at some point?
Sure. So this is kind of another one of those frustrating questions because photo archivists typically avoid like interventive cleaning treatments that are more complicated than a soft brush or a hurricane blower, one of the little blowy things that you squeeze. With a fresh fingerprint, I might gently wipe the slide with a microfiber cloth to remove it. But beyond that, conservators can certainly remove more stubborn dirt and contamination by utilizing chemical solvents, but that does require accurate process identification and intimate knowledge of deterioration in various processing methods. Some unpredictable damaging effects can result from solvent cleaning as well as like DIY at home cleaning. Also, archivists tend to avoid liquid-based treatments. I know there are a number of photo and film cleaners on the market as they can cause the gelatin binder in photographic images to swell. And I think this would also be a good point to mention here is that it's important to wear nitrile and cotton gloves to avoid fingerprints when handling photographic materials. They prevent smudges as well as the potentially corrosive oils on your hands from coming into contact with your materials. If you've ever worked as a machinist, you're probably familiar with the term ruster. These are individuals with higher than normal amounts, up to 3 times more, of sodium chloride in their sweat. When their hands come into contact with silver in photographic images, it can cause visible discoloration or even permanent fingerprints to form. And we do see plenty examples of this in historic collections, and these are usually from rusters, as well as some of those photographers who handled their images while they still had developer and fixer on their hands. So yeah, wear gloves.
Definitely.
Yep.
Jim Wilson asks, what environment does he need for storing slides and negatives in a more humid area? I'm sure that's a concern for a lot of people who might live in the South particularly, but you know, a lot of places get pretty humid in the summertime, even with air conditioning.
Sure. So I guess the simple answer would be a way to lower and stabilize the humidity within your storage space. Best would obviously be an automatic humidity control system incorporated into your HVAC. However, large room consumer dehumidifiers may be more affordable and practical. You can also get those silica gel beads, and they work as a desiccant when placed in storage containers with photographs.
I'm guessing some of those same archival supply stores might be able to help you with those. Um,
Absolutely.
good question from Lyman Holmes, who asked if negatives aren't labeled, how do you distinguish between nitrate film and safety film? How should nitrate film be preserved and stored? And when did safety film replace nitrate film?
Sure. So I think I have a lot of slides I can show you about this. Give me 1 second and I'm going to pop them up.
Sure.
This is actually a great question to geek out on.
We wanted to give you a chance to do a couple of those.
Sure. So I'm just going to present my shell. All right. Are you seeing my slide?
Yes.
Okay. So when you're dealing with nitrate versus acetate, there are several visual cues that can reveal the base. First off is edge printing. Many manufacturers stamp professional sheet films with identification along one edge of the border. The words generally identify the manufacturer and the type of film. So it's going to be nitrate, and you can kind of see faintly that in my slide here. And then acetate-based film is going to be labeled safety. Another thing that you can look for in cut sheet film are notch codes. These are small codes cut along one edge of the film border by the manufacturer. These help photographers identify the film type in the darkroom. When you're dealing with Kodak film produced before 1949, nitrate films typically have a V-shaped notch and acetates have a U-shaped notch. This is helpful for some types of sheet film, but there are other formats that are not as revealing. For instance, film pack, which are very thin sheets of film used in special holders where the photographer pulled a paper tab after each exposure, do not have identifying marks. So with these types, you would have to consider the dates of creation, format, and deterioration characteristics, which is lucky because I have slides on those too. So acetate versus nitrate. these are the general manufacture dates. If you have some metadata that's accurate about when the image was produced, you can sometimes use these to identify the base. Generally, cellulose nitrate was manufactured between 1889 and 1951, while acetate was manufactured between 1920s and the present. This can vary somewhat by format, and I am not going to read through all of these for the sake of time, but we will be like putting these out via email. I should note too that Eastman Kodak is the only manufacturer that has supplied any dates on nitrate film production, so these dates do not necessarily apply to other manufacturers. They also don't give an indication of when Kodak started selling safety films. For example, nitrate sheet film production ended in 1939, but Kodak began test marketing safety-based sheet film sometime in the 1920s. So for most formats, there's going to be a carryover period where both types of film are made. Okay, and then moving on. So another way to determine a film base is deterioration. So nitrate-based film can produce nitric oxide as a gas when it decomposes. And this is in the presence of atmospheric moisture, and these gases combine with water to form nitric acid. And this can further degrade the cellulose film base and can destroy enclosures in which the negatives are stored. It can even damage materials stored in close proximity to the collection. This type of decomposition can be very rapid, and deterioration is generally categorized into 6 progressive stages or visual cues. Here I've just pulled an example. I guess you would maybe call this around a stage 3, so it would be giving off kind of a nitric odor. They tend to turn amber or brown, they soften, they stick to stuff, and eventually they just disintegrate into brown powder. It's pretty nasty. And acetate is pretty similar, except it's going to be producing acetic acid. And it undergoes chemical reactions within the plastic support. So generally you're going to see curling. Negatives can also turn reddish or bluish. That's due to anti-halation dyes that are in the base. They produce kind of a salad dressing vinegar smell. They can shrink. Bubbles can form, and as you can see here, the film can also kind of ripple and channel. I was actually able to pull one example of this from our collections. Unfortunately, we do have a few that are somewhere around this stage. But yeah, if you're looking at a really deteriorated negative, these are kind of the ways to tell if it's acetate or nitrate. And then finally, there are some tests, and we call these destructive tests because they destroy the thing that you're doing the test on. And I would say these are last resort things and should always be done under supervision of a professional or a conservator. They do both involve chemicals, and one involves fire. I would say don't try these at home, or if you do, try them under a fume hood if you have one, or outdoors wearing an acid or organic vapor related cartridge in a respirator. And this is a great image. This is actually moving image nitrate film. If you do a burn test, definitely don't set the whole roll on fire. Use a small snippet. I think that pretty much takes us to the end of nitrate versus acetate.
Well, great slides. And I think the real concerns over those are the tightly wound rolls of movie film for nitrate, which has been known to combust in warehouse environments that have gotten above, I think, is it 90 or 100 degrees Fahrenheit?
It's typically 100. But yeah, I was going to say a little bit about storage. I don't know if there's time.
It's probably worth mentioning quickly, at least.
Sure. So in terms of storage of nitrate, They should be stored in paper enclosures, most ideally within a freezer. Nitrate film, as we just mentioned, is a fire hazard. It can also off-gas some pretty nasty stuff. If you breathe it in too much, it can be a health hazard. Deteriorated moving image nitrate film can spontaneously combust when it's at the certain level of deterioration and reaches a temperature around 100 degrees. There has not been a documented case of this happening with still film. It's the tightly wound moving image film bound in the tin canisters that you have to worry about. That said, it still can be a hazard if its storage space catches fire. And I would recommend that if you have some at home, figure out a way to not store it at your house or get it reformatted.
All right, well, I think that covers all of the analog questions. I know we're running a little bit over time here, and we do want to spend some time on digitization since that was the question that we have received the most, the topic we received the most questions about, and more than 30 of them.
Yeah.
So in the time we have left, and so, you know, certainly we can go a little bit late here. Why don't we just take a little bit of time and talk about our digitization workflow?
Sure. I'm going to have to present my screen again. I've got a few slides on this.
Great.
I will try to do so quickly. All right, so here's a quick digitization overview of what we're doing at the center. I hope to answer a lot of your digitization questions within kind of going through this process. So currently at the center, we utilize both scanners and DSLRs in our digitization efforts. We usually prefer DSLRs over scanners because of their speed. However, there are pros and cons to both, and individuals need to decide what's best for them. DSLRs may decrease the time spent digitizing, but the possibility of human error is likely greater with a DSLR. Exposure times are set manually, and negatives and slides are usually positioned manually rather than within a holder. DSLR images may require more processing in post as well, because not everything is automatic. Plus, DSLR operations can require a longer investment of time to set up, as I'm about to show you. So this is our negative digitization setup. For negatives, we utilize a DSLR suspended above the negative via a copy stand. The camera is connected to a laptop via a USB. We use Camera Control Pro to operate our Nikon camera via the laptop and EOS Utility to operate our Canon. So in this setup, the negative rests flat on an illuminated light table so that it's evenly backlit. Negatives with a slight curl can be secured with L-shaped brackets. And we sometimes use film holders for warped negatives. So I'm currently using a Nikon D800 fitted with a 60mm macro lens to capture images of large format negatives. And we tend to keep the camera at an ISO of 100 or 200. Since the negatives are generally larger and not as flat as slides, we do tend to use smaller aperture settings as well to provide a greater depth of field, typically f11 or even f16. And the shutter speeds can vary widely as negative films tend to have a wider range of densities. We typically use aperture priority mode on the camera and allow its processing to choose the shutter speed. This can range from 1/15 of a second or to even 4 seconds for very dense film. And this is also a good question, or a good place to answer a question that we received just about digitization in general regarding tracking the movement of collection materials. So when we digitize images, we don't use any specific type of tracking system to catalog their movements. We're small enough that this has never been an issue. If something's being worked on and needs to be like researched, or I need it for an image request, I can usually just holler into the processing room that I need it. This does not work at larger institutions at all. Usually collection management systems are utilized to track the temporary locations of various items. Also at the Wisconsin Historical Society, they utilize a system where you actually have to check out barcoded collection materials via a little library checkout stand when you're working on them so people know where they're at. I am going to move on to slides now. So as you can see, we have kind of a unique setup for shooting slides. This is actually Scott's brainchild. And Scott, if you feel like you want to jump in here at any point, like let me know. But here you can see a Canon Rebel camera with a 100mm macro lens aimed into a slide projector with its lens removed. And this particular lens in this setup was so that we could get it close enough to get full frame images of the slides with the projector set up this way. And the projector is here to add a degree of automation to the process. And this was originally Scott and Jordan who figured this out. This required a simple modification or two. Here the lens has been removed from the projector and a diffuser element has been inserted into the front of the bulb assembly. And the diffuser here is just kind of a glossy piece of photo paper, which is cut to fit and is held in place with tape. I've circled it in red, if you're wondering.
Yeah, it's a pretty simplistic setup. And this is a Kodak Ectographic 3 carousel projector, which has this metal housing for the lamp and then the internal condenser lenses. And so that placed enough space between the heat of the bulb and that sort of end place where you were able to put that diffuser element so that it's not getting too hot. Because again, that's just a simple piece of glossy photo paper. And we added that to knock down the intensity of the light and also to even out the light so that when we were shooting the slides with the digital camera, we get a nice even light source. So that was the reason for doing that. We have since upgraded the system. We're now using the Nikon D800. We had to get a 200mm lens, a macro lens for that setup. And again, that's just to be able to have enough reach to get all the way inside the projector and get a full frame image of the slide from within there. And again, yeah, this is all just trying to add as much speed to the process as we can since we're dealing with such high volumes, while also retaining a really good image quality. And we've been able to make 2-page spreads out of the magazine out of these images with a lot of success. And Ken asks if that's the projector we've used to digitize all the slides from the collections that we've published, and yes, it is. We've changed the bulb several times, but the projector is still going strong.
Okay, I am gonna, for the sake of time, maybe move beyond our exposure recommendations for slides. So all of this information you can find in our out of the archives columns, which are on our website. So I just wanted to briefly touch on scanner capture resolutions. So when we're capturing images via DSLR, we typically set up the shot so the original image fills the whole frame. We're able to capture images that are between 4,000 to 5,000 pixels along the longest side. And when printed at a resolution of 300 dpi, these can make fully detailed 8x10 prints, if not larger. This is the archival standard for digitizing. However, to get the same results when scanning, you need to set the scanner's resolution to an appropriate PPI, and a lot of people have expressed interest about this. So I have included this chart, which includes the size of the original and also the resolution you would need to hit the archival standard. This is also in Out of the Archives, and it's from column 8. So I will send this out as well, but I'm going to move on here. So note about image file formats. When capturing images on the DSLR, we simultaneously shoot a camera raw as well as a JPEG. And when scannering, we capture a TIFF as well as a JPEG. The JPEG is usually used as the access copy for the image. This is for posting online and for image requests, while the camera raw is maintained as the unedited master file. A lot of folks asked about which file format is best for archiving. And in general, archivists prefer lossless image file formats such as TIFF or camera raw. I should specify that camera raw is not necessarily always a recommended format because it's proprietary. You need special software to open and view it. But also, so the reason the JPEG is not recommended is because when JPEG files are open, modified, and resaved, they go through what's called lossy compression. This means a little bit of the image data is lost every time the file is modified and resaved. I decided to try this out for myself. Initially thinking that all I needed to do was open and close the image to actually see some type of compression. I tried that about 100 times and nothing happened. And then I realized you need to open it, make a global change, and then resave it to actually see some of the deterioration. So a lot of people don't work this way, and I certainly understand if people want to use high-res JPEGs as their archival copy. Just make sure you're not opening and modifying these images. That's technically against our archival standards, but that can just stay between us. And I'm assuming that deterioration is visible to everybody. Okay, I'm getting it.
That would be the circle on the right-hand image. That'll be the circle points you can see in the sky there, where you're starting to see some JPEG compression. And again, that's only after 10 iterations. Which if you're going back and working on a file, you can do that 10 times pretty quickly.
Sure. Okay, moving on. So someone asked if we post-process our digital images and kind of what our opinions are of doing that to archival materials. So most archivists take a fairly minimal approach to this, believing that the digital surrogate should be as accurate a representation of the original media as possible. At the center, we do optimize images that get posted to our social media or published in our magazines or books, or even featured in our exhibitions. It can be somewhat subjective as to what makes a good image or print, but mostly we look to make minor adjustments to exposure, tonal gradation, and the alignment of the image. I also think we have a certain amount of latitude here, as we're mostly working with negatives and slides. And these are not usually considered the final rendering of artistic intent the way that prints are. But in general, I would say as long as you're making kind of minimal edits and you're keeping, kind of a master image that represents the original, I don't see a lot of harm in optimizing it just for viewing pleasure.
And a quick question here, Adrian, just to point out, I mean, clearly this image has been flipped in the processing, and could you say why?
Well, it's a glass plate negative, so we actually digitize them upside down to make sure not to scratch the emulsion. So the original image that we captured as the negative needed to be flipped to be right reading. This is from the Jim Shaughnessy historic glass plates. Okay, metadata capture and file naming. We've had a lot of questions about this as well. So file naming, basically our current system is based on the photographer's name and the image's physical position within the collection. So when we see an image file name, we know immediately which box and sleeve it is within that collection. This is not a universal convention for file names. It just works for our organization for certain collections. I've seen a lot of photographers who use maybe a combination of the date the photo was taken with the name of the railroad depicted to organize their files. There's not really one best way to name your files. Everybody has different needs. There are a few things to keep in mind. Naming conventions can be simple or complex, but most importantly, you need to be consistent. Follow one naming pattern throughout your collection in order for it to make sense. Also, each file name must be unique. Two images with the same file name and extension can't exist in the same folder, and it would be pretty confusing if they could. And also, I would not recommend entering your entire image caption as your file name. File names have character limits, and it becomes difficult to manage these files with long descriptive names. Plus, if the file name were to be altered in some way, say you accidentally batch rename a group of files, you'd be losing all of that contextual information. And that brings me to how we're currently recording our metadata. And here you can actually see, I just took a little snapshot of an Excel spreadsheet with various fields of the VRA core metadata. As you can see, there are many, many fields. There's about 77 to be precise. Um,
Looks like abstract art at this level.
I know. So we're using this to record descriptive, administrative, and technical information about the images in our collections. This is a rich standard, and we do not utilize every single field. We originally adopted this standard for its readily accessible applications, which I'll show you in a minute. But it does have its drawbacks. It's quite labor intensive to record information for every single one of these fields for every image, even when we're skipping some. And right now we are in the process of selecting a dedicated collection management system, and we'll be reviewing and possibly choosing a new standard in the next year or so, depending on what our consultants say. So one advantage of this metadata system is it allows us to batch import our metadata in our Excel sheets into Adobe Bridge, and then basically transfers those to XMP data for every single image based on its file name. And this is done through the metadata import-export tool. It's a JavaScript plugin specifically developed by the VRA from the Adobe Bridge JavaScript UI. I also wanted to mention here that so you don't necessarily need to use the VRA system to enter metadata for your images that's embedded. You can definitely do so through Bridge or through Adobe Photoshop. It is meant to be permanent and remain with your files, and it's a really powerful tool for organizing and managing your digital files via one of these management systems. I should mention, though, that embedded metadata is not indestructible. There are a variety of programs and services that can strip it. Applications such as GIMP or Adobe Aperture, and also most social media sites. And this is one of the reasons why we actually record our metadata in Excel first, so we have a backup in case, the metadata gets stripped. And I would say if you want to start working with embedded files at home, it's always a good idea to have the information backed up and maybe do a few tests with a new application before you necessarily commit to it. I also wanted to give a few examples of where you can find embedded metadata in the wild. So when we upload our files to Flickr, the metadata we've embedded in the file immediately populates the description field as well as the XIF. And you can also find this information in the info panel in Photoshop. I believe it can be edited there as well. And now we're on digital preservation, and we're 7 minutes over. Should I just keep going?
We've still got everyone tuned in, so let's sally forth.
Okay, all right. So
what everyone came for anyway, so we always save the best for last.
Right. So there were a lot of questions on digital preservation. And just following along kind of our workflow here, once collections have been digitized and embedded, we store the image files along with the accompanying metadata spreadsheet on external drives. The prevailing digital preservation philosophy at the center is that lots of copies keep stuff safe. 3 identical sets of files are maintained for each collection. We store the files in triplicate to ensure that we always have backups in case of data loss or drive failure. And one set is kept at our archival partners institution, that's Lake Forest College in Lake Forest, Illinois. And this is in case any type of disaster should befall the drives at the center's office in Madison. We also use a mix of solid state and hard disk drives. Different media types can kind of back each other up in case one should fail.
You get all your hard drives from the same manufacturer and they're the same brand and the same type. If there's some inherent defect, they could all go bad simultaneously. So that's what we're trying to avoid there.
Right. Yeah, that's really well put. And then we update the hard drives regularly. When changes are written to one set of files, they basically need to be reflected on all the other drives, which is maybe one of the drawbacks of the process. Also, a conservative estimate for the life expectancy of the external drive is currently 3 to 5 years for commercially available drives. So we do replace our drives and migrate our files to new ones every 3 years or so. So these are the levels of digital preservation. I'm not going to go through every single one right now, but I thought it would be worth kind of showing people what a more rigorous digital preservation program would look like. A lot of people have asked what are the steps we would need to take to start collecting born digital. And basically, digital materials are at risk due to a number of factors. The storage media on which they physically reside can fail or become out of date and unusable, such as floppy disks, for instance. The software programs with which files are created can become obsolete, making older formats unreadable by newer versions. The basic bits that comprise digital content can become corrupt over time. This is typically referred to as bit rot. Files can be mismanaged or lost before becoming acquired by a repository, and decontextualization due to lack of descriptive information or metadata can happen. Managing all of these risks can be daunting and complicated. This is the tool that guides smaller institutions, and it was compiled by the National Digital Stewardship Alliance. This is a tiered set of guidelines and practices intended to offer clear baseline instructions on preserving digital content at 4 progressive levels of sophistication across 5 functional areas. The matrix you're seeing here was most recently updated in 2019. Like I said, I'm not going to go through every single level right now. I'm sure there are probably some specific questions regarding the definitions of the various functional areas, and maybe we can take those at the end or address them in supplementary material. So obviously this can get really complicated, and even at the center, we're not at level 4 in every one of these categories. And this is one of the reasons why we're going to be seeking a consultant when we're looking at digital preservation procedures. It would be great if there was just a service to manage all of this for you and store your files. And there are some, or at least there are a variety of tools one can use to help manage all of this activity. The problem with most of them is that they're expensive, and pricing is often based on how many gigabytes, or in the center's case, terabytes of storage you need. So a lot of smaller institutions just try to manage this stuff in-house or partner with larger organizations. And speaking of other people managing your materials, that brings me to an interesting topic, the cloud. A lot of folks have asked me if cloud storage is a suitable stand-in for hard drives or other local storage devices. And I will say it's got advantages and disadvantages. Advantages include convenience, unlimited storage, access from any computer, and no physical media to really mess with. But there are a few things to keep in mind when you're looking at cloud storage as something archival. First of all, there is no cloud. Your stuff is on someone else's computer and most likely a server farm. You don't know where these servers are located, and cloud services often cycle data from one location to another in order to mitigate some of the risks of natural disaster. But it can be difficult to get details about where your files actually are. Access to your files can be complicated at times. Cloud storage requires a reliable internet connection, and many people live in areas with poor internet infrastructure. So you may have difficulty getting all those terabytes of information on the fly. Also, there's questions as to whether services may charge for access for image retrieval. I know that we looked at Amazon Glacier as a possibility, and that was one of our concerns. And there's also the event that you might become incapacitated for some reason, and a question of would your family be able to gain access to your cloud accounts. Another thing to keep in mind is that the permanence of your files is directly tied to the permanence of the service or the company. What if they go bankrupt? Make sure you have some kind of contingency plan for retrieval in that type of event. Another concern is privacy and security. A lot of cloud storage providers have privacy policies that are difficult to understand. And like any other data storage system, they are susceptible to unauthorized access from time to time. And then another final factor, and this is probably an important one for a lot of people, is cost. Cloud costs can add up over time. Many cloud storage services that start out free and only charge when you reach a certain threshold become more expensive with time. So when you're looking at these things, consider the long-term subscription costs, as well as what would happen to your files if you're unable to pay somehow. If you miss an automatic credit card payment, are your files just going to disappear? Stuff like that. And these are just some of the many reasons that archives have traditionally shied away from cloud services and tend to store and manage files locally. That said, this is not always practical for every institution or for every individual. Only you know what's best for your materials. In general, dealing with the cloud, what I can suggest is, and digital preservation in general, is a multi-pronged approach. Utilize some physical storage media such as hard drives, and maybe spend some time researching cloud storage services. If you do decide to go with the cloud, the best path may actually be to find two that are independent of each other and within your price range. That way, if one happens to one of them, you still have the other. Also, just in terms of all of your cloud accounts, have a password manager, an account manager, and have a plan for who's going to handle your digital assets should something happen to you. Whether that's a family member or your lawyer, it's just important to have a kind of an explicit succession plan. But those are my thoughts on the cloud.
Sounds like it's a not an either or prospect, but a both and.
Yeah, I think it's a both and. And I mean, a lot of larger institutions, like archives at colleges and places like that, they have their own IT department with their own like servers. So they don't necessarily deal with this problem as much as smaller institutions do. I mean, I certainly have my reservations about the cloud, but I could see us using that as some form of backup in the future. So
Yeah, no, it seems like it'd be another good safeguard to add down the road.
yeah, definitely.
Do
Okay,
you have
well,
anything else prepared to say about digital preservation or storage?
that's about it for me. I can certainly talk more in detail about the various levels of digital preservation. But in general, that's kind of an area where I've been generally trained, but I'm definitely not a specialist.
Sure. Why don't you pull that slide back up just to go through it again for anyone who's still interested. While you do that,
Yeah,
I'm gonna hit a couple of questions that came in earlier through the Q&A. Um,
sure.
One, Adam Mikowski asked if we're able to generate revenue through photography orders, and if so, is that a steady source of income? We do get a little bit. First of all, I guess I should say that for individual personal use as well as for use by other nonprofit organizations, we do not charge fees right now. We may need to start charging research fees in the future, just based on the fact that we get a lot of image requests from people asking us to look through a large group of photographs for something kind of specific. And in those cases, we may need to look into instituting some research fees. But the usage fees themselves for individuals and nonprofits are we don't charge anything right now, and we'd like to, we plan to keep it that way. For commercial use, we do charge fees, and as grown, they become better known. We have seen a considerable uptick in that. It's certainly not nearly enough to cover the cost of doing this, but every little bit helps. I mean, we're still primarily a membership organization that lives on the generosity, the incredible generosity of our members and our community of supporters, all of you out there who are our members and make donations to us. We've been fortunate to get some grants, and we continue to compete often successfully for those. And there's some program service revenue through our conferences and traveling exhibitions and publications. But by and large, we're supported by you, and so we want to be able to do what it is you want us to do to meet your needs for the community, and we are so grateful for all of that support. But we're certainly trying to generate as much revenue as we can from as many different places as we can, while still keeping our making these photographs as accessible and as available to as many people who want them as possible. That's a really good question, Adam, and I appreciate you asking that. And another one I'll just do quick, then turn it back over to you, Adrian. But Phil Burton, you asked earlier about whether we will accept digital scans of negatives and slides. And I would say yes, along with the negatives and slides. We're not in a position to accept only a scan. We're still looking at that analog image as being our archival copy right now. But if you've already scanned those, we would very gladly accept those alongside. It certainly makes record keeping and access a lot easier, for people who have done that. So a couple of questions I thought I'd hit right there, Adrian, and back to you for the levels of digital preservation here.
Sure. So I can talk a little bit about each functional area and kind of what it means. I'm also not sure right now which monitor I should be facing to actually talk to you. Is this correct?
One. No.
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I've been looking at the wrong one for a while. All right. So the first factor you can see on the grid is storage. And this focuses the attention on the storage of digital preservation or digital information. As one moves up the levels, one is keeping additional copies, which helps hedge against threats of loss due to bit rot and failures in storage and media systems. Similarly, as one moves up the levels, one incorporates additional geographic locations to hedge against regional threats like natural and man-made disasters to the storage system. I'd say also this functional area is one we've done particularly well at. I'd say we're somewhere around a level 4. So moving on, the second group is integrity, and the goal of this category is to provide a series of steps that will take the organization to a stage where it is actively and robustly working to ensure the fixity of their content or files. And this involves fixity checking of individual files. This is the process of verifying that a digital object has not been altered or corrupted in any way. And this process is used to ensure that digital files have not been affected by data rot or any other digital preservation dangers. By itself, fixity checking does not ensure the preservation of a digital file. Instead, it allows a repository to identify which corrupted files need to be replaced with a clean copy from the producer or from a backup. So the third functional area is control, and this section focuses primarily on understanding who has access to the content, who can perform what actions to it, and also enforcing these access restrictions. The fourth functional area is metadata, and this section deals with basically the data about the data. Here the term is defined broadly and includes inventory information about the location of files, as well as broader sets of administrative metadata. For example, when and how something was created and who can access it. It also includes transformative metadata documenting and logging events that have resulted in changes in objects. And finally includes technical and descriptive metadata. Also, at the highest level, you'll start recording preservation metadata about the files themselves. But at the lower levels, it's more essential metadata, such as the basic just inventory of the collection. And then the last one is content. And this basically deals with digital objects and their file formats. Digital objects are intimately dependent on the structure and nature of their file formats. The first level simply suggests that organizations, when possible, encourage the use of limited sets of known and open access file formats. Successive levels then begin to document the formats in use, monitor them for obsolescence issues, and ultimately we would engage in migrations and support emulation or look to other modes of ensuring that preserved content is usable and accessible in the future. Those are all the definitions.
a lot to manage.
Yeah, I hope all of that made sense.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Um, we've had a couple more questions come in that I wouldn't mind trying to field. One of them, Tom Fleming's actually asking just to see some examples of our metadata. And I have the Furler index file up here since I was working on the book. If you could pass over the presenter badge, I could at
Absolutely.
least share this real quick and just give a little bit of an enlarged run through of what you were showing in abstract a
Yeah.
little while ago.
Can you tell me how to pass the presenter?
Oh, yeah. So I think if do you have the list of panelists at the right there?
I do not, but I can.
Okay.
That's the chat. Here's the participant list.
Okay. And then if you just right click on Center for Railroad Photography and Art. Oh, actually, I can do
Okay.
this myself. Never mind. Oh, I have the power.
Yep.
All
There you go.
right. Let's see here. So I'm just going to share. Let's see. Does that look good, Adrian?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
That looks like it.
Yeah, so this is an example from our Furler collection of how we're using the VRA core metadata in Excel. And I have all of the various fields which run in each column are visible right now. You see we're not using all of them. We start with a file name over here in column A. And as Adrian mentioned, we reference the actual physical location. So Furler's the name of the collection. 01 refers to the first box. 001 refers to the first page within the first box, and then that last 01 refers to the first image on the first page in the first box. And we do this primarily so that if there's ever a need to rescan an image or go back to the physical copy from the digital image, we know exactly where to find it. Next we have work creator, work titles, a repeat of file name. There's a lot of these things that are repeated, and it's just necessary to use them in VRA core, particularly because we're using an import feature to embed the metadata into Adobe Bridge. And so some of these files, even these fields are redundant, but we have to use them anyway. After work title, we have the work date. Uh, these are all still images. They're black and white negatives. Scrolling over measurements, these are all 5x7 inch negatives. It's a place for repository. Um, and then we next fill in the locations, which would be the site city, country, and then state or province. And that's the order that VRA uses. That's the order that we use. There are fields for GPS if you want to include that. We do not. Work creation location just combines the city, country, city, state, and country into a single field. Scrolling further, work ID references back to file name. There's a place where we can list their work rights, including our copyright to these. Oops. And I skipped ahead. Work description is where we get into a little bit more details. And here we are simply just recording verbatim what the photographer had listed. This photographer used paper envelopes to keep his negatives. It's an exceptionally well organized and well identified collection. And on each of these paper envelopes, he actually typed, in most cases, his caption information. So this particular box features the Lehigh and Hudson River Railway up in the New Jersey and New York. So we have the reporting marks, LHR, we have a wheel arrangement, 482, a locomotive number. RS refers to right side. This photographer identified all of his roster and action shots by right side and left side. If it was an action shot, he noted that, whether the train was eastbound or westbound, what it was carrying, and in a lot of cases, how many cars. And in some cases, details and more. And so we've recorded all of these in the metadata for this collection. You can see that within each collection, within each railroad in the collection, it's been organized by locomotive number. And so the LNHR starts with their 482s, which were 10, 11, and 12, and then it continues up from there into higher locomotive numbers. Continuing to the right, there's several fields that we're not using, but you can see over here there are some custom fields. We don't use all of the custom fields, but we do have a few of these specifically for, did I skip over them? They must be coming later. Sorry, again, some of these things are repeated, and I typically have these hidden. see. Oh, we need to update our address in these. That's a fun
Oh, yeah,
task
we
in
do.
the future. We just moved in January. Let's see. Oh, yes, here we are. So finally, and you can see we're up into, there's 70 some fields now that we've gone through. But there are custom labels here where we added fields for reporting marks and the railroad names. And so we've done that, and we have those listed here. Um, we also have a place where we list the person who cataloged these. Usually that's Adrian or Natalie or one of our interns. This was one that I actually did when we were in between interns, and so I'm listed here as the admin cataloger. We list the box. Again, these are all from box one, so that's just a repeat of basically what you see in the file name. And then again, some of these things are repeated. Another one though that we do use is this custom data 6. And these are the photographer's original negative numbers. This organization scheme was broken up at some point, so they're not actually still in this order, but all of these numbers appear on the labels of the envelopes, and so we've recorded that as well. And so that's, and then again, there's a lot more data that you can use that we choose not to, all the way up to the, well, basically about 75 fields there. So that's everything in one of these Excel spreadsheets. This is all metadata for the further collection. You can see we have tabs down here at the bottom. Each tab references each box in the collection. And if we keep going there, I think there's 20 some boxes in this collection. And this is actually a relatively small collection for us. This is only about 5,000 negatives. You can imagine what these look like when we're dealing with tens of thousands of slides or negatives, as some of our larger collections are. But again, it's this is what makes the collection so usable going forward in terms of being able to search and find different things. It's been fascinating for me in this collection to go back through and organize it by date, because the photographer organized everything by locomotive number within railroads. But if you go back and rearrange it by date, you can put together, his entire days and what he saw out there on the railroads of the Mid-Atlantic states in the 1940s, and what we wouldn't give for the time machine to be able to go back and check that out. But anyway, that's an example of our metadata and how we're recording it right now. Again, I think one of the advantages, Adrian, of using Excel is that whatever content management system we select going forward, we should be able to go back to Excel and import this data. I'm sure there'll be some headaches in that, but theoretically it should all be easily to migratable.
Yeah. Yeah, if we don't find one, I mean, we may even be able to find one that works with the metadata already embedded in the files too, which would be great.
Yeah, that would be our Excel over there. And then let's see, yeah, a lot of people still on. Thank you for sticking with us. We did get a question about any of the consumer grade scanners for 35 millimeter slides. I can speak to that one briefly. One of the struggles we have is that there aren't as many new scanners being manufactured now. The Nikons were really kind of the gold standard for a number of years, and those are no longer being produced new. We also have a Minolta Damage 5400 that I just love. I think it's the sharpest 35 millimeter scanner I've ever used, at least short of a drum scanner. You can find those used. The Nikons you can find used as well. They're usually a couple of $1,000s. The Minoltas aren't quite as expensive. They tend to run maybe even the 500 to 750 range. I've seen on eBay. That's where the centers that we use came from. And you typically have to find a third-party software to use with it. We use Silverfast to power our scanners. So those are excellent options. In terms of things being made new now, PlusTech and Microtech are both making new 35 millimeter scanners. We have one of those, I believe it's a PlusTech, that was down at Lake Forest for a while, so I haven't used it in quite a while. It's not bad. It's not quite as good as the Minoltas. Frankly, I think we're getting better image quality out of the Nikon D800 camera than we were at that scanner. The Minolta scanner, I think, is certainly comparable, if not maybe a smidge better than the Nikon camera. But the PlusTech scanners aren't bad, but they're not quite as good from my experience. No flatbed scanner that I've ever used has been able to maintain enough detail resolution for scanning small 35 millimeter negatives or slides. Medium format and larger, some of the Epson flatbed scanners that have the transparency light lids. We have a V700, which works great for medium format and larger. We also, and I think they have a V800, maybe even a V850 now that are even similar models, but even better along those lines. So I guess that would be my quick overview of scanners. We also had a specific question about storing the 616 and 116 postcard size negatives for someone who's been using glassine and would like to upgrade now. Would you have any advice there, Adrian?
I think I'm trying to think if I've seen anything specifically in that size. I think there are certainly like polypropylene slide pages you could use that are specific. But you may even be able to get the individual paper sleeves. I would look maybe somewhere like Gaylord Archival or University Products first. They usually have the widest selection. I mean, I guess depending on, what shape the negatives are in, you may want to go with the paper over the plastic. If you're handling them a lot, though, then maybe you should go with the plastic. So,
Sure. Well, that is, I think we got through all of the questions, if I
yeah,
didn't miss any that came in on the Q&A. Thanks everyone for all of your interest.
yeah,
Adrian, thank you for just a spectacular job in pulling together all this information and presenting a lot of pretty technical stuff in an easy to understand format.
sure.
I will point out quickly as a little parting gift here, I'm going to share my screen again. So this is our website. Is that up now, Adrian?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so this is our website, railphoto-art.org. If you go to the collections tab at the top and click that, it takes you to our main collections page. And then there are several tabs up there at the top. If you click this one, out of the archives, that is the column that Adrian publishes in every issue of our journal, Railroad Heritage, benefit to members. Good reason to join if you're not a member already. You'll get 4 issues of that every year. But we do publish on our website PDFs of all of these out of the archives. And so this has some really great information about a lot of the things Adrian's been talking about tonight and a lot of the questions you've been raising. And so each one of these is available here on the right-hand side. If you click one of these, it will actually bring up the PDF. So this is the very first one back in fall of 2015 when Jordan Radke was our archives manager. But we typically go through and address a couple of topics. Sometimes we add definitions for archival terms. There's a good resource here, the www.2.archivist.org/glossary has archival terms, a lot of other good information on that archivist.org site. And then typically a topic that is addressed here, and then there's always an update of just what we've been working on in our processing. So like we need to post a couple more recent ones, but here's a more recent one where we're talking about preparing your collections for donations to archives and what our process looks like for that and what some other institutions look like. This information is also on our website. So again, all of these are available for free download off of our website here, and they also appear in every issue of the magazine, where we try to tackle more of these archival topics because we know it's a topic that's important to all of you out there.
I wonder if it would make sense to almost put the slides up from the presentation.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, let's maybe we can post those on the site and we'll send a link in an email out to everyone in a couple of days. And if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with us on email or social media or anything else. We'd be happy to take more. And John Calgill, thanks for tuning in tonight. And he mentioned that he hopes to see us in September. We hope to see you too. We'd love to get together in person in stores. We're actually having a meeting with their staff by video conference at the end of the month to talk about what that might look like. We'll let you know as soon as we find out about that. But if we can't do it in person there, we will certainly do something online on September 19th. So definitely plan on seeing us on September 19th or online. So thanks everyone for tuning in. And again, we'll be happy to take further questions down the road and hope to see you again soon. Adrian, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks everyone, and we'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Good night.